The following Appalachian Mountains horror stories are real, disturbing, and should be used as warnings. The names and locations have been altered to protect the individuals involved. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine being 7. Your mother dies from skin cancer just 1 month after you move to a new place. You are lost, lonely, and thinking things couldn't get much worse. The Appalachian Mountains will show you they absolutely can. Meet Edward. He just wanted to find a little peace and joy. He walks into the woods while his dad unpacks. He quickly regrets that decision. It was just a random Tuesday. Grief hung heavy in the quiet of their new house, so Edward slipped past the backyard tree line to find a gift for his dad. He wore his dad's old military combat liner. The thick canvas completely swallowed his small frame as he walked under the massive pines. Utility cargo pants bagged around his ankles, the pockets stuffed thick with half-eaten granola bars and shiny brass casings he found near the porch. Deep in his front pocket sat a folded silk scarf. He kept his fist clamped tightly around it, breathing in the lingering scent of his mother's perfume just to stay grounded. His small, dirt-stained hands clutched tiny fossils, jagged quartz stones, and a sturdy walking stick. He collected these pocket treasures as little offerings to make his dad smile. He pushed through the brush for 20 minutes. Suddenly, the crunching of his own footsteps didn't matter anymore. Edward froze, his heart hammering hard against his ribs. A tall, unnatural shape shifted in the deep shadows ahead. Whatever that shape was, it vanished back into the trees before Edward could make sense of it. He took a shaky breath and pushed onward. Down in these deep Appalachian hollows, a false twilight drops over the woods. The steep mountains block out the sky, meaning the sun sets down in these pockets hours before it gets dark everywhere else. Edward headed down a steep ridge toward the sound of a rushing riverbed. Stinging nettle whipped against his exposed ankles, leaving thick, burning red welts. The cloying, sweet-rot smell of decaying leaves filled his lungs. His legs began to itch fiercely, so he hurried toward the water to wash off the sting. That's when the weird stuff started showing up. Right there in the dirt, a handful of shiny silver jacks glimmered. A few feet later, perfectly clean playing cards sat scattered near the tree roots. Then, a piece of pink bubble gum resting directly on the damp moss. Edward scooped each little treasure up, stuffing them deep into his cargo pockets. He finally reached the riverbed. The freezing water rushed fast, about 2 feet deep and 50 feet across. Right in the middle of the rapids, a bright red toy fire truck sat perfectly wedged between 2 river stones. Edward waded in and reached out for the toy, but his heavy boot slammed onto a piece of slick rock. He crashed hard into the water, slicing his leg open on a jagged stone. He scrambled to stand up, but the river current pushed aggressively against his small chest. He yanked his leg upward. It didn't budge. His foot was completely wedged in a crack below the surface. He was trapped. But as he gasped for air, a tall, dark shadow shifted on the riverbank directly in front of him. Ice-cold mountain water rushed straight into Edward's nose and mouth. He gagged, coughing up the river, and screamed for his dad. The tall shadow on the bank stepped directly into the freezing rapids, closing the distance fast. Suddenly, the slick rock beneath the surface shifted. Edward yanked hard, his bleeding leg popped free. But before he could scramble away, 2 massive hands clamped under his armpits. A strange man hoisted Edward out of the rushing water and set him safely on the muddy bank. "You okay, buddy?" the man asked. Panic spiked hard in Edward's chest. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. The man reached deep into his dirty jacket pocket. He extended a giant, calloused palm. Sitting right in the middle was a piece of pink bubble gum wrapped in bright yellow paper. an exact match to the gum Edward had just found scattered in the dirt. "Let's get that leg patched up at my tent," the man said. Grief had completely stolen Edward's voice over the last month. A foggy, heavy silence locked his throat tight. He was an absolute physical wreck. His legs burned raw from the stinging nettles, his sliced shin throbbed, and his freezing ankle screamed in pain from the rocks. Add in the sheer panic of almost drowning, and he was completely overwhelmed. Every single alarm bell in his head was ringing. His gut screamed at him to just mouth "thank you" and limp home. His dad's absolute #1 rule echoed in his brain: never go anywhere with a stranger. But his dad had also drilled it into him to always respect his elders. Torn between the rules, freezing cold, and emotionally numb, Edward's traumatized brain just short-circuited. He nodded. He followed the strange man into the thick trees. And as a heavy mountain fog rolled in, completely erasing the path back home, a sickening dread twisted in Edward's stomach. He realized, right then and there, that he had just made the absolute worst decision of his entire life. The gray ghost fog, a thick, wet blanket native to these deep hollows, completely swallowed the trail. The mist was so heavy it made 5 feet look like 50. Every tree looked exactly the same, stripping away Edward's sense of direction. After a few minutes of blind walking, a dirty canvas tent loomed in the mist. It sat pitched directly against a massive, crumbling stone chimney, but there was no house attached to it. The chimney just stood out there in the dying light like a giant brick tombstone. The man caught Edward staring. "My great-grandfather's home," the stranger explained, his voice flat. "That's why I live out here now." They ducked inside the cramped, foul-smelling tent. The man pushed Edward down onto a makeshift stump chair and turned his back to dig around for a Band-Aid. But as Edward looked down at the dirt floor, a freezing spike of adrenaline hit his blood. Piles of brightly colored children's toys littered the edges of the tent. There were blocks, broken action figures, and more shiny silver jacks. But the tent was dead silent. No other children were anywhere in sight. "Are you out here alone?" the man asked, his back still turned. That single question snapped Edward awake like a rubber band. The foggy exhaustion vanished, replaced by pure, screaming hypervigilance. His dad's strict rule violently echoed in his skull: never say you are alone. The man slowly turned around. "Where exactly is your dad?" he pressed, taking a step closer. "Right across the river," Edward lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. A slow, terrifying grin stretched across the man's dirty face. "That's weird," the man whispered. "I never saw him." Edward shot up off the stump. "I have to go." But before Edward could take a single step toward the exit, thick, dirty fingers clamped onto his shoulder like an iron vise. "Hold on," the man muttered. "Before you leave, I have a gift for you." Absolute terror paralyzed the 7-year-old. Warm urine soaked through his oversized cargo pants, but he bit down hard on his bottom lip, desperately holding back tears. Suddenly, the man dropped Edward's shoulder. He turned his back and started aggressively rummaging through a pile of trash in the corner of the tent, muttering rapidly to himself. He stepped outside into the heavy fog, and that muttering quickly escalated into a frantic, angry conversation with absolutely nobody. Edward crept to the canvas flap and peeked out. The stranger was waist-deep inside that abandoned stone chimney, violently tossing heavy rocks and debris out into the mist. The extreme stress and the mountain altitude triggered Edward's chronic nosebleeds. Hot, metallic-tasting blood suddenly dripped down his chin. That was it. He bolted. He exploded out of the tent and sprinted for the riverbed. He smashed through the freezing rapids and scrambled desperately up the far, muddy bank. A furious roar echoed through the hollow behind him. The man had turned away from the chimney and was sprinting full speed toward the water. Edward ran blindly into the trees. But the mountains always fight back. His heavy boots snagged on something hidden in the brush. Rusted barbed wire, half buried in a tree trunk from 50 years ago, bit deep into his calf. He slammed face first into the dirt, screaming for his dad. Heavy splashing ripped through the river. The man was crossing. He was closing in fast. Edward squeezed his eyes shut and braced for those giant hands to grab him. Then dead silence fell over the woods. Edward slowly opened his eyes. And what he saw in that exact moment is something he will remember for the rest of his life. The man wasn't attacking him. Instead, he was standing completely still on the opposite bank, just staring across the water. Slowly, the man raised one giant, dirty hand. He smiled a huge, horrifying smile, gave Edward a slow wave, and then simply turned around and walked away into the thick fog. Edward stumbled blindly through the back door of his house, violently sobbing in pure panic. His clothes were soaking wet. His leg was dripping hot blood onto the kitchen floor, and he was completely out of breath. His dad dropped a moving box and rushed over, listening in absolute horror as Edward choked out the story of the smiling man, the hidden tent, and the piles of children's toys. The very next morning, his dad grabbed his hunting rifle and marched straight into that mountain forest. He tracked Edward's muddy footprints to the river, crossed it, and found the massive stone chimney. But the dirty canvas tent was completely gone. The only things left behind in the dirt were the exact items Edward had described: the bright building blocks, the broken action figures, and those shiny silver jacks. His dad went home and built a massive high wooden fence around their backyard that very week. Edward never stepped foot in that forest again. A lot of people look at the Appalachian Mountains and just see beautiful hiking trails. But if you look at the cold, hard numbers, it paints a terrifying picture. Across the Appalachian states, roughly 15,000 to 20,000 people are reported missing every single year. While most are found, hundreds of them simply cease to exist. Over the last 2 decades, dozens of children under the age of 10 have vanished in these woods under completely unexplained circumstances. There are actual ghost clusters out there, deep pockets of the woods where people disappear at 3 times the normal rate. In 20% of these wilderness vanishings, there is zero physical evidence left behind. No torn clothes, no footprints. When search dogs are brought in, they almost always lose the scent right at a creek or a boulder field, acting as if the child was just lifted straight up into the air. Locals and investigators call it the rough man theory. Feral men living completely off the grid, watching from the shadows. Out in the city, you have cameras, witnesses, and police sirens. But out in the deep Appalachians, there is only the wind and the ancient, hungry silence of the trees. So let this story be a warning. If you go into these woods as a young child, you are not just hiking. You aren't just getting lost. You are being hunted. And it is a real possibility you could get abducted. Picture yourself sitting by the campfire with your new friends from the office. You are joking, laughing, and making memories before it is time to call it a night. You all get to the tent and go to sleep. But hours later, you wake up and hear something outside. You open the tent and witness the most disturbing thing you have ever seen in your life. Meet Russell. He is an accountant who wanted to try something different to spice up his life. Instead of a fun weekend, he made a choice that would leave him wishing he had stayed safely. Russell stared at the bright, safe glow of his computer screen, wishing he could just stay there forever. He was an accountant, not an outdoorsman. Because of that, his only goal for this forced 3-day weekend in the Appalachian Mountains was simple: keep his head down, survive the trip, and get back to his desk alive. But his extroverted co-worker, Jesse, a former Division I athlete, had aggressively pushed this trip to spice up their lives. Jesse, Russell, and a quiet, analytical chess player named Sebastian were complete rookies who had never slept outside. Since they had no idea what they were doing, Jesse did all the YouTube research. He bought a single pop-up tent and mapped out what he promised was an easy 6-hour hike. But the forest did not welcome them. The trail shot violently uphill. With every step, Russell's brand new boots ground against an ingrown toenail, shooting fire up his leg. To mock their total lack of skills, Jesse had strapped a massive stuffed toy dog to his heavy backpack, cheerfully slapping their camp protector to keep morale up. Suddenly, as they trudged around a blind corner, a tall, unnaturally long shadow stretched across the dirt path, then violently vanished into the trees. Russell froze. Desperate to hold it together, he blamed it on exhaustion, brushed it off, and forced his burning legs forward. At the 3-hour mark, they finally reached a flat clearing. Russell dropped his heavy bag in the dirt, but as he leaned his weight against a thick pine tree to breathe, his palm slid into a sticky, oozing groove. He pulled his hand back, his skin crawling. Slashed deeply into the bark were 2 massive, violently fresh letters: CB. Panicking, Russell immediately showed the fresh cuts to the other 2, begging them to turn back. But Jesse just rolled his eyes, brushing it off as some dumb kids playing in the woods. Dismissed and outvoted, Russell was forced to keep moving, but a cold knot of suspicion sat heavy in his stomach as they left that spot. Left with no other choice, they set up the pop-up tent, sparked a cheap Amazon fire kit, and ate their self-heating meals. But then the wind shifted. A sharp, metallic scent instantly flooded the campsite. Russell dropped his plastic fork. He knew that exact smell because his dad had been a mortician. It was the heavy, sickeningly sweet copper stink of fresh blood. "Do you guys smell that?" Russell whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. But Jesse just laughed with a mouthful of food. He jokingly told Russell to loosen up and stop trying to find a fake excuse to get out of the trip. Sebastian completely ignored him, assuming it was probably just a dead squirrel. Since Jesse had just shot him down for the second time and made him feel like an absolute idiot, Russell's face burned with embarrassment. He wasn't about to get laughed at again. So, he swallowed his fear, blindly trusted he was safe in numbers, and zipped himself into the tight nylon tent to sleep. But in the pitch black, the forest went dead quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the slow, heavy crunch of massive footsteps pacing in a perfect circle, right outside the thin fabric. Because he knew his co-workers already thought he was annoying them, he figured they wouldn't believe him anyway. He tried to convince himself he was just hearing things, keeping his mouth tightly shut as he desperately forced himself to ignore the heavy crunching just inches from his head. The next morning, the sun broke through the trees. They unzipped the tent to pack, but sitting in the dirt, stopping them dead in their tracks, were 5 empty cans of Chef Boyardee. They were arranged in a mathematically perfect circle right around their pop-up tent. They had only packed plastic pouches. Nobody brought heavy metal cans. Instead of freaking out, Sebastian just knelt in the dirt, clinically calculating the weight someone had to carry up the mountain to place them there. Jesse, however, just burst out laughing. "Hey, remember those deep CB carvings on the tree yesterday? Chef Boyardee, the mountain is giving us room service." Russell broke into a cold sweat. What if Jesse was actually right? But then, Jesse dropped an absolute bombshell. He hadn't lied about the trip, but he had conveniently withheld the rest of the truth. He was taking them 3 hours completely off the grid to find a cool, abandoned cabin surrounded by weird rock formations he saw on a Reddit forum. Going off trail in the Appalachian Mountains is incredibly dangerous for rookies. Russell completely lost his mind, demanding they go back to the car. But Jesse calmly stepped up and went into full coach mode. He promised his new compass and map would keep them safe. He looked right at Russell and told him he was tough and could handle this. Hearing the big athlete's confidence, Russell actually believed him, calmed down, and blindly followed him into the deep brush. 3 exhausting hours later, they broke through the tree line and reached a massive hidden clearing surrounded by jagged boulders. But as Russell dropped his bag, his stomach turned. A thick column of greasy black wood smoke churned into the sky, and the air absolutely reeked of scorched meat. Russell froze, realizing the terrifying reality of their situation. They were 3 hours off the grid. They were supposed to be entirely alone. There absolutely should not be a fire or cooking meat out here. Panicking, Russell pointed at the smoke and begged them to leave. But Jesse just sighed, telling Russell to chill out and stop making up excuses to ruin the trip. Jesse arrogantly tossed the pop-up tent into the dirt at the edge of the clearing. Hesitantly, and scared out of his mind, Russell crawled inside with Sebastian. He just wanted to leave, but he kept to himself, intensely playing a Nintendo Switch to try and drown out the silence of the woods. But then, about 25 minutes later, a single dry leaf exploded like a gunshot right outside the nylon fabric. His heart hammering, Russell slowly unzipped the door. A massive bonfire raged barely 20 feet away. Beside it sat a cheap white plastic folding table. Russell's brain completely short-circuited. How did someone silently build a roaring fire so close without making a single sound? But it was the man standing there that made Russell's blood turn to ice. A giant, 6 feet 5 inches, 260-pound hiker with mud-caked boots stood frozen by the fire. Over his clothes, he wore a bright white butcher's apron completely splattered in dark, dried blood, and a tall white chef's hat. He was locked in a rigid trance, his mouth hanging wide open, staring dead at fresh CB letters carved into a nearby pine tree. The environment felt like a locked oven. But Jesse stepped out of the tent, and instead of running, his massive ego took over. He let out a forced laugh and yelled, "Chef Boyardee!" Instantly, the man's trance snapped. He smiled politely, walked straight over to the table, and cheerfully welcomed them. Trying to prove he wasn't scared, Jesse walked over and sat down. But Russell and Sebastian stayed rooted to the spot, completely refusing to move. Seeing them refuse, the man's expression didn't change, but he slowly reached behind his bloody apron. He pulled out a massive, rusted machete. He didn't swing it. He just laid it flat on the plastic table with a heavy thud, looked directly at Jesse and whispered, "Please take a seat right beside me." Jesse's face went pale. He finally realized he was sitting at a dinner table with a monster. The giant man reached directly into the roaring bonfire bare-handed. He grabbed a blackened pot, lifted his machete, and used the rusted blade to slowly stir the boiling red sludge inside. The sickening smell of cheap tomato sauce mixed with the metallic stink of old blood. He shoved a massive plate against Jesse's chest and cheerfully recited robotic trivia about how the pasta company was founded. But that was it. Sebastian's mind completely shattered. The quiet chess player spun around and sprinted blindly into the thick, dark woods. Russell's lungs tightened in absolute panic. He desperately begged the giant man to let them go find their friend. Hearing the plea, the man stopped stirring. He slowly raised the dripping machete and pointed a massive, filthy finger at the stuffed toy dog strapped to Jesse's bag. "Give me your dog so I won't be lonely," the man whispered, his voice completely hollow. Numb with terror, Russell ripped the fake protector off the bag and handed it over. The giant man gently cradled it like a real baby and smoothly stepped aside. He was actually letting them walk away. But as Russell exhaled and took his first step, the man smiled. He lifted an old, chunky Polaroid camera and pressed the button. A blinding white flash violently exploded in Russell's face. "To add to my collection," the man whispered from behind the blinding spots, "so the others aren't lonely as well." Pure panic took over. Russell and Jesse grabbed their heavy backpacks and sprinted blindly into the pitch-black woods. Branches whipped their faces. Mud sucked at their boots. After hours of agonizing running, they finally burst into the gravel lot just at sunrise. Sitting right there by Jesse's car was Sebastian, violently shivering but alive. They sped straight to the park rangers. But 3 days later, the rangers called. They hiked to Jesse's exact GPS coordinates. There was no cabin, no bonfire, no empty cans. Just silent, empty woods. Today, Russell sits safely at his computer screen. He will never go into the woods again. But his heart still hammers every time a camera flashes. He knows his Polaroid is sitting on that plastic table so the giant man won't be lonely. It sounds completely far-fetched, but the real horror of the Appalachian Trail is the math. Roughly 1 in 4 hikers report terrifying encounters with off-grid weirdos. Every 50 people you pass, one will trigger an absolute fight-or-flight response. Sure, the murder rate is 1 in 15 million, but 6 people vanish without a trace every single year. Out there, a 911 response takes days. A sketchy stranger isn't just a nuisance, they are the only other human in your entire universe. That is why I'm telling you this. You might think bringing a big group of friends keeps you safe, but the mountain doesn't care how many people you bring, because the mountain is always hungry. In the ancient Appalachian hollows, the party music is nothing but a mask for a predatory silence watching from the ridgeline. Meet Bricks, who was invited to a legendary Ridgetop rager, but is about to get a jagged awakening to why the locals never leave their porches after the sun hits the valley floor. 3 years ago, Bricks traveled deep into the Virginia Appalachian Mountains. His only goal was to hang out with his cousin Paul, drink some cheap beer, and actually relax for the first time all semester. That chill plan went straight out the window because Paul brought along their mutual buddy Riker. Bricks had met Riker a handful of times over the years. Riker was a pure Appalachian wildcard, an absolute blast for exactly 2 hours before his ideas usually required a first aid kit or a fast getaway. You could only take him in small doses as he was constantly hunting for the next adrenaline rush. Naturally, Riker caught wind of a massive secret ridgetop banger and dragged Bricks and Paul into the truck to chase it. 5 miles out from the cabin, the GPS completely flatlined. They had to navigate a washed-out logging road in the pitch black, using only the headlights to spot rusted no trespassing signs in the thick mountain fog. Finally, they broke through the tree line. A massive A-frame cabin glowed against the woods, the floorboards vibrating with heavy trap music and packed with 30 sweating college kids. A massive wave of relief washed over Bricks as they stepped into the safety of the massive crowd. He leaned against the rotting back deck to catch his breath in the freezing air. Beside him, Paul pulled his phone from his jacket. The screen suddenly lit up with a brand new text message. Bricks leaned in, his stomach completely dropping. The top left corner of the screen clearly read, "No service," and the nearest cell tower was 2 ridges away. So how was someone, or something, sending them messages out here in the dead zone? Bricks shoved the glowing screen toward Paul, but his cousin just laughed, blaming the weird text on a glitchy mountain cell tower. Before Bricks could argue, Riker kicked the heavy sliding glass door open, shoved 2 dripping red solo cups into their hands, and dragged them inside to join the chaos. For the next hour, Bricks actually tried to relax. The party was a chaotic mix of cheap kegs, heavy trap music rattling the floorboards, and the humid breath of 30 sweating college bodies. But the air inside the A-frame eventually grew thick and suffocating, driving Bricks back out onto the freezing pine-scented back porch to clear his head. Down in the shadows by the rotting woodpile, a local man in a tattered Carhartt jacket stood completely still, his jaw working in a jagged rhythm as he whispered directly into Riker's ear. Bricks gripped the wooden railing, unable to hear the words over the muffled bass, but noting exactly how Riker's posture stiffened into a rigid, predatory lean. Suddenly, Riker pulled away. He didn't wave Bricks over or explain what was said. He simply shoved a crumpled piece of paper deep into his flannel pocket and disappeared back into the crowded kitchen. Bricks kept his eyes locked on the stranger by the woodpile. The man didn't follow Riker inside. Instead, he slowly raised a rusted hatchet and pointed the heavy blade directly toward the pitch-black ravine behind the generator shed, completely ignoring the driveway. What exactly was waiting for Riker down in that dark hollow? Bricks couldn't shake the image of that heavy, rusted blade pointing straight down into the black ravine. The floorboards downstairs were violently shaking from the subwoofers, driving him up a narrow, creaky staircase to the second-story balcony just to get a moment to think. Up here, the freezing Appalachian wind cut straight through his jacket, carrying the sharp, damp scent of wet pine needles. He stared out into the absolute pitch-black void of the valley. Suddenly, 3 distinct white LED beams clicked on across the opposite ridge. The blinding lights cut through the thick mountain fog, flashing on and off in a fast, rhythmic code. Bricks's brain scrambled to make it make sense. Were those coon hunters? No, you don't hunt this close to a blasting stereo. Was it a search and rescue team? If it was, they would be driving up the road, not flashing signals from 3 separate positions in the deep timber. A cold sweat broke out across his neck. The flashes were deliberate. Whoever was out in the freezing woods was coordinating. He immediately sprinted back inside, shoving past a group of sweating college kids spilling tequila shots in the hallway, desperately hunting for Paul and Riker. He pushed into the humid kitchen, finding the heavy glass sliding door sitting wide open to the night. A guy in a backward frat hat leaned against the counter, casually mentioning that Riker went down into the woods to find the patch about 5 minutes ago. Bricks lunged for the open doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. Just as his boots hit the rotting back deck, every single car alarm down in the muddy gravel lot started blaring in perfect unison. If everyone was inside drinking, who was triggering all the vehicles at the exact same time? The blaring car alarm sent a massive spike of adrenaline straight through Bricks's chest. He grabbed Paul by the jacket, and the 2 of them sprinted off the rotting deck, plunging straight into the freezing tree line. Their phone flashlights clicked on, but the thin white beams barely cut through a thick mountain fog that suddenly smelled heavily of wet copper and decaying dirt. The thumping trap music from the cabin was instantly swallowed by the dense, towering pines. The flashlight beams swept across the forest floor, catching a fresh, violent path of snapped branches and trampled rhododendron bushes. Bricks and Paul scrambled down the steep, slippery embankment, desperately screaming Riker's name into the heavy, oppressive mountain silence. The muddy path abruptly dead-ended at a jagged limestone drop-off. Sitting right on the very edge of the dark cliff was a single mud-caked sneaker next to a crushed red Solo cup. Brix and Paul completely froze in the freezing mud. Drifting up from the pitch-black void directly beneath the ledge was a heavy, wet, rhythmic wheeze that did not sound entirely human. If Riker was trapped down there in the dark, struggling to breathe, why was he completely ignoring them shouting his name? Brix's muscles locked tight as the heavy, wet wheezing grew louder from the darkness below. Suddenly, a chaotic shape lunged violently from the rhododendron brush, slamming hard into Brix's chest. It was Riker. Both of his boots were completely gone, and his face was a swollen purple mask of mud, blood, and raw grit. He was hyperventilating, choking on the freezing mountain air. Brix and Paul grabbed his jacket, dragged him up the slick embankment, and sprinted back into the blinding lights of the cabin. They slammed the heavy sliding glass doors shut, immediately dragging a massive oak harvest table across the frame to barricade it. Slumped against the kitchen cabinets, Riker gasped out the truth. The local down by the woodpile hadn't mentioned a party. He promised a massive patch of wild mushrooms. When Riker reached the bottom of the dark ravine, 3 massive men stepped out of the timber, holding thick plastic zip ties. Riker only survived by screaming a desperate, insane lie. 30 drunk college kids were actively live-streaming his phone's GPS and would swarm the hollow in exactly 60 seconds. The bluff caused the men to hesitate just long enough for Riker to scramble up the jagged cliff. A massive wave of relief washed over the kitchen as Riker finished the story. But as Brix exhaled, a shadow blocked the yellow porch light. The man in the tattered Carhartt jacket was standing on the rotting back deck, pressing his greasy forehead against the cold glass door and smiling. If Riker's threat of a 30-person mob had worked, why was the local man now trying to get inside? The grinning face pressed against the freezing glass instantly shattered any illusion of safety. Absolute panic erupted through the A-frame. 30 terrified college students scrambled out the front door, abandoning jackets and half-empty kegs in a desperate sprint for the muddy gravel lot. Engines roared to life all at once. Tires violently spun in the freezing mud, throwing rocks into the tree line as a chaotic 10-car convoy tore blindly down the pitch-black logging road. 30 minutes later, the truck's tires finally slammed onto the smooth pavement of the main highway. The sudden artificial glow of amber streetlights flooded the cab. A massive, suffocating weight lifted off Brix's chest. He slumped low into the passenger seat, his hammering heart finally starting to slow down. He exhaled heavily and cast one final look into the side mirror. A single pair of jaundiced yellow headlights was perfectly pacing their truck in the total darkness. They had been silently followed for the last 20 miles. Just as Brix locked onto the reflection, the trailing vehicle abruptly killed its lights and swerved off the pavement, vanishing straight into the unbroken black timber. Despite the terrifying chase, Brix, Paul, and Riker never once dialed 911. The A-frame cabin was completely loaded with illegal drugs and underage kids. They were absolutely terrified that calling the police would just end up ruining their own lives with massive felony charges. So they simply drove back to campus in dead silence, leaving whatever was hunting them out in those woods entirely unchecked. Out in the deep Appalachian Mountains, the ancient timber doesn't need ghosts or monsters to swallow you whole. It just needs you to make one reckless choice. When you mix the complete isolation of a mountain hollow with the chaotic, illegal decisions of a college party, you create the absolute perfect trap. The scariest thing in those woods isn't what's hunting you in the dark. It's the fact that when you finally escape, your own secrets will force you to keep your mouth shut, leaving the trap wide open for the next group of unsuspecting kids.